Various parts of the body are rubbed with oil, the hair is cut, while the sponsors blow and spit at an imaginary devil. All this is necessary to purify the child and to make him a Christian. Then it is instilled into the parents that they ought to administer the sacrament to the child, that is, give him, in the guise of bread and wine, a portion of Christ's body to eat, as a result of which the child receives the grace of God within it, and so on. Then it is suggested that the child, as it grows up, must be taught to pray. To pray means to place himself directly before the wooden boards on which are painted the faces of Christ, the Mother of God, and the saints, to bow his head and his whole body, and to touch his forehead, his shoulders, and his stomach with his right hand, holding his fingers in a certain position, and to utter some words of Slavonic, the most usual of which, as taught to all children, are Mother of God, Virgin, rejoice thee, etc. Then it is instilled into the child, as it is brought up, that at the sight of any church or icon he must repeat the same action, i.e. cross himself. Then it is instilled into him that on holidays are the days on which Christ was born, though no one knows when that was, on which he was circumcised, on which the Mother of God died, on which the cross was carried in procession, on which icons have been set up, on which a lunatic saw a vision, and so on. On holidays he must dress himself up in his best clothes and go to church, and must buy candles and place them before the images of the saints. Then he must give offerings and prayers for the dead, and little loaves to be cut up into 3-cornered pieces, and must pray many times for the health and prosperity of the Tsar and the bishops, and for himself and his own affairs, and then kiss the cross and the hand of the priest. Besides these observances, it is instilled into him that at least once a year he must confess. To confess means to go to the church and to tell the priest his sins, on the theory that this informing a stranger of his sins completely purifies him from them. And after that he must eat with a little spoon a morsel of bread and wine, which will purify him still more. Next, it is instilled into him that if a man and woman want their physical union to be sanctified, they must go to church, put on metal crowns, drink certain potions, walk 3 times round a table to the sound of singing, and that then the physical union of a man and woman becomes sacred and altogether different from all other such unions. Further, it is instilled into him, in his life, that he must observe the following rules: not to eat butter or milk on certain days, and on certain other days to sing Te Deums and Requiems for the dead, on holidays to entertain the priest and give him money, and several times in the year to bring the icons from the church and to carry them slung on his shoulders through the fields and houses. It's instilled into him that on his deathbed a man must not fail to eat bread and wine with a spoon, and that it will be still better if he has time to be rubbed with sacred oil. This will guarantee his welfare in the future life. After his death it is instilled into his relatives that it is a good thing for the salvation of the dead man to place a printed paper of prayers in his hand. It is a good thing further to read aloud a certain book over the dead body, and to pronounce the dead man's name in church at a certain time. All this is regarded as faith obligatory on everyone. But if anyone wants to take particular care of his soul, then according to this faith he is instructed that the greatest security of the salvation of the soul in the world is attained by offering money to the churches and monasteries, and engaging the holy men by this means to pray for him. Entering the monasteries too and kissing relics and miraculous icons are further means of salvation for the soul. According to this faith, icons and relics communicate a special sanctity, power, and grace. Even proximity to these objects, touching them, kissing them, putting candles before them, crawling under them while they are being carried along, are all efficacious for salvation, as well as Te Deums repeated before these holy things. So this and nothing else is the faith called orthodox. That is, the actual faith which, under the guise of Christianity, has been with all the forces of the Church, and is now, with especial zeal, instilled into the people. And let no one say that the orthodox teachers place the essential part of their teaching in something else, and that all these are only ancient forms which it is not thought necessary to do away with. That is false. This, and nothing but this, is the faith taught through the whole of Russia by the whole of the Russian clergy, and of late years with especial zeal. There is nothing else taught. Something different may be talked of and written of in the capitals, but among the 100 millions of people this is what is done, this is what is taught, and nothing more. Churchmen may talk of something else, but this is what they teach by every means in their power. All this, and the worship of relics and of icons has been introduced into the works of theology and into the catechisms. Thus they teach it to the people in theory and in practice, using every resource of authority, solemnity, pomp, and violence to impress them. They compel the people by overawing them to believe in this, and jealously guard this faith from any attempt to free the people from these barbarous superstitions. As I said when I published my book, Christ's teaching and his very words about non-resistance to evil were for many years a subject for ridicule and low jesting in my eyes. And churchmen, far from opposing it, even encouraged this scoffing at sacred things. But try the experiment of saying a disrespectful word about a hideous idol which is carried sacrilegiously about Moscow by drunken men under the name of the icon of the Iversky Virgin, and you will raise a groan of indignation from these same churchmen. All that they preach is an external observance of the rites of idolatry. And let it not be said that the one does not hinder the other, that these ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. This was spoken of the Pharisees, who fulfilled all the external observances prescribed by the law, and therefore the words, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, refer to works of mercy and goodness, and the words, do not ye after their works, for they say and do not, refer to their observance of ceremonies and their neglect of good works, and of exactly the opposite meaning to that which the churchmen tried to give the passage, interpreting it as an injunction to observe ceremonies. External observances and the service of truth and goodness are for the most part difficult to combine. The one excludes the other. So it was with the Pharisees. So it is now with the church Christians. If a man can be saved by the redemption, by sacraments, and by prayer, then he does not need good works. The Sermon on the Mount or the Creed? One cannot believe in both, and churchmen have chosen the latter. The Creed is taught and is read as a prayer in the churches, but the Sermon on the Mount is excluded even from the gospel passages read in the churches, so that the congregation never hears it in church except on those days when the whole of the gospel is read. Indeed, it could not be otherwise. People who believe in a wicked and senseless God who has cursed the human race and devoted his own Son to sacrifice, and a part of mankind to eternal torment, cannot believe in the God of love. The man who believes in a God, in a Christ coming again in glory to judge and to punish the quick and the dead, cannot believe in the Christ who bade us turn the left cheek, judge not, forgive those that wrong us, and love our enemies. The man who believes in the inspiration of the Old Testament and the sacred character of David, who commanded on his deathbed the murder of an old man who had cursed him, and whom he could not kill himself because he was bound by an oath to him, and the similar atrocities of which the Old Testament is full, cannot believe in the holy love of Christ. The man who believes in the Church's doctrine of the compatibility of warfare and capital punishment with Christianity cannot believe in the brotherhood of all men. And what is most important of all, the man who believes in salvation through faith in the redemption or the sacraments cannot devote all his powers to realizing Christ's moral teaching in his life. The man who has been instructed by the Church in the profane doctrine that a man cannot be saved by his own powers, but that there is another means of salvation, will infallibly rely on this means and not on his own powers, which they assure him it is sinful to trust in. The teaching of every church with its redemption and sacraments excludes the teaching of Christ, most of all the teaching of the Orthodox Church with its idolatrous observances. But the people have always believed of their own accord as they believe now, will be said in answer to this. The whole history of the Russian people proves it. One cannot deprive the people of their traditions. This statement, too, is misleading. The people did certainly at one time believe in something like what the Church believes in now, though it was far from being the same thing. In spite of their superstitious regard for icons, house spirits, relics, and festivals with wreaths of birch leaves, there has still always been in the people a profound moral and living understanding of Christianity, which there has never been in the Church as a whole, and which is only met with in its best representatives. But the people, notwithstanding all the prejudices instilled them by the government and the Church, have in their best representatives long outgrown that crude stage of understanding, a fact which is proved by the springing up everywhere of the rationalist sects with which Russia is swarming today. and on which churchmen are now carrying on an ineffectual warfare. The people are advancing to a consciousness of the moral, living side of Christianity. And then the church comes forward, not borrowing from the people, but zealously instilling into them the petrified formalities of an extinct paganism, and striving to thrust them back again into the darkness from which they are emerging with such effort. "We teach the people nothing new, nothing but what they believe, only in a more perfect form," say the churchmen. This is just what the man did who tied up the full-grown chicken and thrust it back into the shell it had come out of. I've often been irritated, though it would be comic if the consequences were not so awful, by observing how men shut one another in a delusion and cannot get out of this magic circle. The first question, the first doubt of a Russian who is beginning to think, is a question about the icons, and still more, the miraculous relics. Is it true that they are genuine, and that miracles are worked through them? Hundreds of thousands of men put this question to themselves, and their principal difficulty in answering it is the fact that bishops, metropolitans, and all men in positions of authority kiss the relics and wonder-working icons. Ask the bishops and men in positions of authority why they do so, and they will say they do it for the sake of the people, while the people kiss them because the bishops and men in authority do so. In spite of all the external varnish of modernity, learning, and spirituality which the members of the church begin nowadays to assume in their works, their articles, their theological journals, and their sermons, the practical work of the Russian church consists of nothing more than keeping the people in their present condition of coarse and savage idolatry, and worse still, strengthening and diffusing superstition and religious ignorance, and suppressing that living understanding of Christianity which exists in the people side by side with idolatry. I remember once being present in the monks' bookshop of the Opchi Hermitage, while an old peasant was choosing books for his grandson who could read. A monk pressed him on accounts of relics, holidays, miraculous icons, a psalter, etc. I asked the old man, "Has he the gospel?" "No." "Give him the gospel." "In Russian," I said to the monk. "That will not do for him," answered the monk. There you have an epitome of the work of our church. But this is only in barbarous Russia, the European and American reader will observe, and such an observation is just, but only so far as it refers to the government, which aids the church in its task of stultification and corruption in Russia. It is true that there is nowhere in Europe a government so despotic and so closely allied with the ruling church, and therefore the share of the temporal power in the corruption of the people is greatest in Russia. But it is untrue that the Russian church in its influence on the people is in any respect different from any other church. The churches are everywhere the same, and if the Catholic, the Anglican, or the Lutheran has not at hand a government as compliant as the Russian, it is not due to any indisposition to profit by such a government. The church as a church, whatever it may be, Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian, every church, insofar as it is a church, cannot but strive for the same object as the Russian church. That object is to conceal the real meaning of Christ's teaching and to replace it by their own, which lays no obligation on them, excludes the possibility of understanding the true teaching of Christ, and what is the chief consideration, justifies the existence of priests supported at the people's expense. What else has Catholicism done? What else is it doing in its prohibition of reading the gospel and in its demand for unreasoning submission to church authorities and to an infallible pope? Is the religion of Catholicism any other than that of the Russian church? There is the same external ritual, the same relics, miracles, and wonder-working images of Notre Dame, and the same processions, the same loftily vague discussions of Christianity in books and sermons, and when it comes to practice, the same supporting of the present idolatry. And is not the same thing done in Anglicanism, Lutheranism, and in every denomination of Protestantism which has been formed into a church? There is the same duty laid on their congregations to believe in the dogmas expressed in the 4th century, which have lost all meaning for men of our times, and the same duty of idolatrous worship, if not of relics and icons, then of the Sabbath day and the letter of the Bible. There is always the same activity directed to concealing the real duties of Christianity, and to putting in their place an external respectability and cant, as it is so well described by the English, who are peculiarly oppressed by it. In Protestantism, this tendency is especially remarkable because it has not the excuse of antiquity, and does not exactly the same thing show itself even in contemporary revivalism, the revived Calvinism and evangelicalism to which the Salvation Army owes its origin? Uniform is the attitude of all the churches to the teaching of Christ, whose name they assume for their own advantage. The inconsistency of all church forms of religion with the teachings of Christ is, of course, the reason why special efforts are necessary to conceal this inconsistency from people. Truly, they need only imagine ourselves in the position of any grown-up man, not necessarily educated, even the simplest man of the present day, who has picked up the ideas that are everywhere in the air nowadays of geology, physics, chemistry, cosmography, or history, when he for the first time consciously compares them with the articles of belief instilled into him in childhood, and maintained by the churches, that God created the world in 6 days, and light before the sun, that Noah shut up all the animals in his ark, and so on, that Jesus is also God the Son, who created all before time was, that this God came down upon earth to atone for Adam's sin, that he rose again, ascended into heaven, and sitteth on the right hand of the Father, and will come in the clouds to judge the world, and so on. All these propositions, elaborated by men of the 4th century, had a certain meaning for men of that time, but for men of today they have no meaning whatever. Men of the present day can repeat these words with their lips, but believe them they cannot. For such sentences as that God lives in heaven, that the heavens opened and a voice from somewhere said something, that Christ rose again and ascended somewhere in heaven, and again will come from somewhere on the clouds, and so on, have no meaning for us. A man who regarded the heavens as a solid finite vault could believe or disbelieve that God created the heavens, that the heavens opened, that Christ ascended into heaven. But for us, all these phrases made no sense whatsoever. Men of the present can only believe, as indeed they do, that they ought to believe in this, but believe it they cannot, because it has no meaning for them. Even if all these phrases ought to be interpreted in a figurative sense and are allegories, we know that in the first place all churchmen are not agreed about it, but on the contrary, the majority stick to understanding the Holy Scripture in its literal sense, and secondly, that these allegorical interpretations are very varied and are not supported by any evidence. But even if a man wants to force himself to believe in the doctrines of the Church just as they are taught to him, the universal diffusion of education and of the gospel and of communication between people of different forms of religion presents a still more insurmountable obstacle to his doing so. A man of the present day need only buy a gospel for 3 kopecks and read through the plain words, admitting of no misinterpretation, that Christ said to the Samaritan woman that the Father seeketh not worshippers at Jerusalem, nor in this mountain, nor in that, but worshippers in spirit and in truth. Or the saying that the Christian must not pray like the heathen, nor for show, but secretly, that is, in his closet. Or that Christ's follower must call no man master or father. He need only read these words to be thoroughly convinced that the church pastors who call themselves teachers in opposition to Christ's precept and dispute among themselves constitute no kind of authority, and that what the churchmen teach us is not Christianity. Less even than that is necessary. Even if a man nowadays did continue to believe in miracles and did not read the gospel, mere association with people of different forms of religion and faith, which happens so easily in these days, compels him to doubt the truth of his own faith. It was all very well when a man did not see men of any other form of religion than his own. He believed that his form of religion was the one true one, but a thinking man has only to come into contact, as constantly happens these days, with people equally good and bad of different denominations, who condemn each other's beliefs, to doubt of the truth of the belief he professes himself. In these days, only a man who is absolutely ignorant or absolutely indifferent to the vital questions with which religion deals can remain in the faith of the Church. What deceptions and what strenuous efforts the churches must employ to continue, in spite of all these tendencies subversive of the faith, to build churches, to perform masses, to preach, to teach, to convert, and most of all to receive for it all immense emoluments, as do all the priests, pastors, incumbents, superintendents, abbots, archdeacons, bishops and archbishops. They need special supernatural efforts, and the churches do, with ever-increasing intensity and zeal, make such efforts. With us in Russia, besides other means, they employ simple brute force, as there the temporal power is willing to obey the Church. Men who refuse an external assent to the faith and say so openly are either directly punished or deprived of their rights. Men who strictly keep the external forms of religion are rewarded and given privileges. That is how the Orthodox clergy proceed. But indeed all churches, without exception, avail themselves of every means for the purpose, one of the most important of which is what is now called hypnotism. Every art, from architecture to poetry, is brought into requisition to work its effect on men's souls and to reduce them to a state of stupefaction, and this effect is constantly produced. This use of hypnotizing influence on men to bring them to a state of stupefaction is especially apparent in the proceedings of the Salvation Army, who employ new practices to which we are unaccustomed: trumpets, drums, songs, flags, costumes, marching, dancing, tears, and dramatic performances. But this only displeases us because these are new practices. Were not the old practices in churches essentially the same, with their special lighting, gold, splendour, candles, choirs, organ, bells, vestments, intoning, etc.? But however powerful this hypnotic influence may be, it is not the chief nor the most pernicious activity of the Church. The chief and most pernicious work of the Church is that which is directed to the deception of children. These very children of whom Christ said, "Woe to him that offendeth one of these little ones." From the very first awakening of the consciousness of the child, they begin to deceive him, to instill into him with the utmost solemnity what they do not themselves believe in, and they continue to instill it into him till the deception has by habit grown into the child's nature. They studiously deceive the child on the most important subject in life, and when the deception has grown into his life that it would be difficult to uproot it, then they reveal to him the whole world of science and reality, which cannot by any means be reconciled with the beliefs that have been instilled into him, leaving it to him to find his way as best he can out of these contradictions. If one set oneself the task of trying to confuse a man so that he could not think clearly nor free himself from the perplexity of two opposing theories of life which had been instilled into him from childhood, one could not invent any means more effectual than the treatment of every young man educated in our so-called Christian society. It is terrible to think what the churches do to men. But if one imagines oneself in the position of the men who constitute the church, we see they could not act differently. The churches are placed in a dilemma: the Sermon on the Mount or the Nicene Creed. The one excludes the other. If a man sincerely believes in the Sermon on the Mount, the Nicene Creed must inevitably lose all meaning and significance for him, and the church and its representatives together with it. If a man believes in the Nicene Creed, that is in the church, that is in those who call themselves its representatives, the Sermon on the Mount becomes superfluous for him, and therefore the churches cannot but make every possible effort to obscure the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount, and to attract men to themselves. It's only due to the intense zeal of the churches in this direction that the influence of the churches has lasted hitherto. Let the church stop its work of hypnotizing the masses and deceiving children, even for the briefest interval of time, and men would begin to understand Christ's teaching. But this understanding will be the end of the churches and all their influence. And therefore the churches will not for an instant relax their zeal in the business of hypnotizing grown-up people and deceiving children. This then is the work of the churches: to instill a false interpretation of Christ's teaching into men, and to prevent a true interpretation of it for the majority of so-called believers. End of chapter 3.